You know, the kind of secret that hides in the corners of the house between locked doors and rehearsed silences? Yeah. Some stories aren't told out of shame or fear of what might be unleashed once spoken aloud. What if I told you that, sometimes, the real terror in a child's life isn't the monsters under the bed, but the muffled voices coming from the room next door? Domestic violence, parental abandonment, childhood trauma. They're real ghosts, hiding behind timid smiles and eyes far too alert for their age. In this raw, intimate, and shadow-laden account, you'll meet Romulo. A boy forced to grow up before he even understood what it meant to be a child. He was raised among arguments and slamming doors, caring for his baby brother while trying to survive guilt, silence, and invisible scars. But that's just the beginning. What seemed like a painful family drama quickly turns into something far darker: an ancestral secret, witchcraft, and a sinister entity that seemed to feed on the suffering within those walls. Get ready to step into an emotional labyrinth, where the supernatural blends with the psychological, and the search for redemption is scarier than any nightmare. This isn't just a confession, it's an invitation to see beyond what meets the eye. Because when a childhood breaks, what's left has to be rebuilt with more than just glue and hope. And sometimes, the past charges a price the present can barely afford to pay. From a very young age, Romulo learned that silence was safer than any word. Growing up with screams, slaps, and slammed doors became as routine as brushing his teeth. The sound of his parents arguing was a constant soundtrack, pounding inside the head of a boy who still didn't know how to tie his shoes. At 5, he already had adult responsibilities: bottle feeding, changing diapers, soothing his crying brother while chaos erupted around him. Parental abandonment wasn't just physical, it was emotional, psychological, and deep. Romulo's childhood was defined by a deafening absence. Even though both parents were alive, he lived as if he were alone. There was food on the table sometimes, but there was no warmth, no affection, no one to look him in the eye and say, "Everything's going to be okay." In its place was a constant feeling of guilt, an inner voice whispering that he was the problem, that his very existence was a mistake. And the worst part? Domestic violence was never predictable. Sometimes, a toy on the floor was enough to trigger an outburst. He grew up walking on eggshells. Over time, he learned to read silence like smoke signals. When his father came home with heavy breathing and a clouded gaze, Romulo knew it was best to disappear. Emotional detachment became his armor. He got used to hiding in closets or under beds, trying to make himself invisible. And even without knowing what a childhood psychological disorder was, he could feel something was deeply wrong. The constant fear, the nightmares, the inability to trust everything pointed to a world where love was a rare and unevenly shared currency. But the most painful thing was the role reversal. While the neighborhood kids played tag outside, Romulo was figuring out how to soothe a hungry baby with no formula in the bottle. There was no room for the lightness of childhood, only the crushing pressure to keep things under control. And no matter how hard he tried, he always felt like he was failing. Emotional neglect leaves no visible marks, but it shapes how you see the world. And there, in the middle of solitude and premature responsibility, he began developing an emotional self-sufficiency that looked more like a survival instinct. It's strange how a child's mind tries to make sense of chaos. Romulo believed that if he were more obedient, stronger, maybe his parents would fight less. That twisted idea, typical of emotional abuse survivors, stayed with him for years. In silence, he promised himself that one day he would protect his brother from all of it. And it's in that setting where the noise of screaming blends with the muffled sobs that his real story begins. Because when childhood is shaped by pain, the soul looks for refuge, and sometimes, that refuge comes from the most unexpected places. In that fear-filled house, there was one place where Romulo could breathe his grandmother's embrace. Dona Alzira was the kind of woman who didn't need to raise her voice to command respect. With calloused hands and a calming voice, she could work magic with a simple plate of rice and a tight hug. When everything seemed to fall apart, it was her room he ran to. There were no screams or slammed doors, just the scent of rosemary on the pillow and whispered prayers by the bedside. That domestic sanctuary became his shelter. His grandmother fed him not only with food, but with words. She used to say evil couldn't win against a heart that prays with faith. And even without fully understanding, Romulo would repeat the prayers with the same devotion he used to hold her hand. Hail Mary, full of grace, became a mantra on the darkest nights. That protective grandmother wasn't just family, she was a spiritual shield. She had no formal education, but she knew everything about spiritual protection. She'd tell stories of angels guarding sad children, and of invisible lights that kept darkness away. The faith that grew inside him wasn't taught in a chick, it was built through tears. A belief forged in the noise of domestic violence and the quiet of whispered prayers. Prayer became a survival tool. While the adults fought in the living room, Romulo hid in a corner and prayed, clutching the tiny wooden rosary his grandmother had given him. It wasn't about religion, it was about having something to hold on to. In the absence of parental love, he held on to God, to hope, and to the feeling that someone even unseen was there with him. And it was in that quiet routine with his grandmother that he learned the meaning of care. She applied ointment to bruises, sang lullabies to calm the baby, and told him, "Pray, my child. Evil can't stand prayer." Those words stayed with him. Prayer became his way of resisting trauma, of building a resilience he didn't even know he had. While the world collapsed outside, Romulo was building a fortress inside himself made of faith, kindness, and a kind of love only those who've suffered truly understand. Over time, prayer stopped being just a habit, it became instinct. Any strange noise or particularly dark night triggered an automatic Our Father. The strange thing was, even amid sadness, his bond with his grandmother kept him whole. In the face of parental abandonment and traumatic childhood, that woman's simple and unwavering affection held together the pieces trying to fall apart. It was there, between prayers and gentle hands, that Romulo began to sense there was more than just pain. What he didn't know was that soon, that feeling of safety would be threatened by forces much darker. It was shortly after his parents' separation that things started to get weird. Until then, Romulo dealt with very human monsters: yelling, slaps, neglect. But suddenly, he began to feel watched. First came the sounds: footsteps in the hallway when everyone was asleep, doors creaking even when shut. Then came the shadows. Small at first, fast, barely visible. But as the house grew quieter, the supernatural presence began to take shape. It felt like the darkness had eyes and they were locked on him. The nightmares began: subtly confusing dreams filled with distorted voices and figures hiding behind curtains. But soon they became vivid and terrifying. In many of them, his mother appeared with a disfigured face, whispering incomprehensible words. He'd wake up drenched in sweat, heart racing. One night, he saw his baby brother's crib rocking on its own. He tried telling his grandmother, but she simply blessed his forehead with holy water and said, "Sometimes, pain attracts things we can't see." And even though he didn't understand, Romulo knew something dark had settled in. What scared him the most wasn't what he saw but what he felt. A strange coldness, a weight on his chest, the sensation that something invisible stood beside him, breathing, waiting, feeding off his fear. The grief from his absent parents, the emotional neglect, it all felt like it opened inner doors he could no longer close. The evil presence didn't yet have a name, but it already had a home. And worse, it seemed to grow in strength as his trauma deepened. As if suffering was a bridge between him and the other side. And he couldn't escape it. His grandmother, sensing something was off, intensified her prayers. She lit candles, placed rue behind doors, left holy water in room corners. But even with all that, the nightmares and visions continued. Romulo started to question his sanity. He began to doubt his own mind, which only deepened his isolation. The combination of childhood psychological distress and inexplicable phenomena drove him further from others. He felt he couldn't trust anyone. It was just him, his brother. And that thing. When you live in fear every day, the line between reality and imagination begins to blur. Romulo no longer knew what was real. The shadows, the voices, his name whispered in the dark. It all became part of an insane routine. The traumatic childhood left invisible wounds, but the supernatural seemed intent on digging deeper. And the truth was behind that dark presence was a bigger secret. A mysterious link between his mother, her pain, and something still waiting to be revealed. The worst was yet to come. Before, Romulo saw his mother as a distant figure. But now, she became a direct source of pain. After the divorce, whatever scraps of affection had existed vanished like smoke. Consumed by bitterness he couldn't understand, she began treating him like an enemy. She said he was a living reminder of the father's betrayal. The rejection was brutal slaps without cause, absurd accusations, and a coldness that hurt more than any punishment. This wasn't just domestic violence, it was an open emotional wound, bleeding inside him every single day. One time, after spilling milk on the tablecloth, she shoved him against the wall and screamed that he was just like his father. Romulo froze, the shattered glass at his feet, drowning in guilt that didn't even belong to him. How could an 80-year-old carry that much pain on his back? The mother-son relationship, already fragile, broke for good. He stopped hoping for affection and learned to live with emptiness. And even without fully understanding, something inside him began to die. A kind of innocence, maybe. Or the hope of being loved by her. The worst part about rejection is that, deep down, he still longed for her love. It was a cruel paradox, yearning for affection from the same person who hurt him. This kind of trauma severely impacts a child's emotional development. It's not just sadness, it's the building of an identity rooted in denial. Over time, he grew quieter. He stopped asking questions, stopped reaching out, stopped trying. Emotional detachment became self-protection. After all, every attempt at closeness was met with aggression or indifference. It felt safer not to feel at all. Her attacks didn't always come through harsh words, they came in cold stares, careless gestures, and the absence that screamed louder than any scolding. It was as if she wanted him to disappear, or worse, to never have existed. And in that environment, every supernatural sign seemed to intensify. The nightmares came more frequently, the dark presence grew stronger. Romulo began to wonder, was the evil he felt coming from outside? Or from inside his own mother? Her rejection didn't just deepen his existing wounds, it strengthened his connection to the darker side of the story. He didn't know it yet, but that strange, cruel behavior hid something far more complex. A heavy, ancestral secret involving pain, witchcraft, and invisible sacrifices. But at the time, all Romulo could feel was pain. Parental abandonment took on even darker shapes. And the worst part? Realizing that, as much as he hated the way she treated him, he still dreamed of the day she might look at him and say, "My son," with tenderness. But maybe that day would never come. It was on a rainy afternoon, years after his mother had died, that Dona Alzira finally spoke. Romulo was nearly a teenager, still burdened with unanswered questions, especially about the strange look his mother had during her final months. Over tea and a rosary, the grandmother revealed that her daughter-in-law had become involved in witchcraft. It wasn't out of malice, she explained, but desperation. The pain of betrayal had led her to seek help from a village healer, one of those women who worked with herbs and ancient secrets. And slowly, the puzzle pieces began to fit. The grandmother said the healer had warned them a malevolent entity was lurking. A force that fed on pain and settled in the cracks of the soul. According to her, this presence latched onto Romulo's mother the moment she let hatred take root. And although she tried to fight it, it consumed her bit by bit. The woman wasn't just angry, she was being manipulated by something she couldn't understand. It explained the empty eyes, the outbursts, and even the memory lapses Romulo had witnessed. That news hit like a stone. For years, he believed he was simply rejected, blamed for things he didn't do. But now he saw that there was something deeper and maybe even scarier. Her involvement in witchcraft had consequences not just for her, but for the entire household. The healer had said the entity didn't just want the mother, it wanted the children too. And that, even in her corrupted state, she had tried to protect them. That contradiction crushed Romulo's chest. How do you hate someone who, in their own way, tried to save you? Over time, he began to revisit childhood memories with a new perspective. The rage, the screaming in the middle of the night, the strange gestures she made in front of the mirror, it all now seemed like part of some unconscious ritual, as if she were being guided by another force. It was witchcraft, yes, but not like the movies. There were no cauldrons or loud spells, there was grief, suffering, and a spirit feeding on it all. And even if he couldn't understand it completely, Romulo began to believe there was truth in what had been told. That revelation didn't erase the trauma, but it opened space for something new: compassion. His relationship with his mother was still marked by hurt, but now there was a seed of understanding. Maybe she wasn't a monster. Maybe she was a victim too, just like him. And that changed everything. The past still hurt, but it began to make a little more sense. And deep down, this truth opened a different path, the path of spiritual search for deeper answers about what had really happened in that house. Because some secrets don't die. They just wait to be uncovered. His mother's death came unexpectedly, just a freak accident, they said. But to Romulo, it never felt that simple. He was 11 years old and, although he felt a strange sense of relief at first, it was soon followed by a heavy, sticky sadness that wouldn't let go. Grief was confusing, didn't know if he was mourning her, the guilt, or everything they never had. He began to dream of her appearing softer, smiling, calm, calling him my love. The dreams were rare, but vivid. As if, in that dream world, she was the mother he had always wished for. Those visions left him torn. During the day, he carried memories of yelling, hitting, and rejection. But at night, that gentle version of her offered a warmth he never knew while awake. Romulo began to wonder, was his mind inventing it to heal the wounds? Or were they signs from beyond? His grandmother used to say that the dead speak when they leave things unfinished. And in their case, nothing had ever been finished. The mother-son relationship never got the chance to heal, and now he carried a kind of suspended grief between pain and tenderness. Even in death, her presence lingered. Sometimes her perfume seemed to hang in the air out of nowhere. Other times, her bedroom felt colder than the rest of the house. His grandmother would pray for her, asking for light and peace. Romulo watched in silence, wondering where forgiveness fit into their story. It wasn't easy. The wounds of domestic violence, rejection, and abandonment were still there. But so was a growing thread of empathy. Maybe, just maybe, This was the beginning of an incomplete redemption, a slow process, where forgiveness doesn't erase, but softens. The guilt from childhood didn't disappear after her death. If anything, it grew heavier. He wondered if he could have done something differently. Prayed more. Obeyed more. Been a better son. Harsh thoughts, but common in children who endure deep trauma. No one ever told him it wasn't his job to carry her emotional instability. The lack of conversation, the family silence, the emotional loneliness. All of it turned pain into unanswerable questions. And the supernatural, once something to fear, now seemed like a possible bridge for reconnection, not terror. Her death didn't bring closure, it brought layers. And with those layers came the realization that not all suffering has a clear explanation. From time to time, Romulo started visiting her grave. He didn't bring flowers, she brought questions. He never expected answers, but he felt something. The spirituality he learned from his grandmother now took on new meaning. It wasn't just about protection, it was about making peace with the unseen. Because sometimes, what we need isn't to understand everything, but to find a way to live with what's left. And in Romulo's case, what was left still needed rebuilding. Romulo grew up, but the scars didn't fade, they just learned to hide beneath the surface. Now an adult, he lives far from the town where it all happened. He's quiet, thoughtful, with a gaze that suggests he's seen too much. He doesn't talk about the past often, but those who know him can sense a depth, a gravity, like someone who's lived things no one should. He doesn't hide anymore, but he also doesn't fully open up. That emotional self-sufficiency, forged through pain, is still his strongest shield. He looks after his younger brother like a father would. The boy was raised mostly by their grandmother, but Romulo never stopped being present. Even from afar, he sends money, calls every weekend, checks in on school, friendships, and dreams. He tries to be the kind of presence he never had. He doesn't do it for praise or recognition. He does it because he knows what it feels like to grow up feeling invisible. The father-son bond he never experienced now lives in the quiet protection he offers his brother, based not on obligation, but on choice. His grandmother, older now, her health fidinges, still the silent pillar of their family. Romulo visits her when he can, sits on the same old couch, sometimes prays with her, not out of fear, but out of respect for the woman who taught him how to endure. They rarely speak of the past. They don't need to. Between a sip of coffee and a quiet breath, everything is understood. Healing didn't come from magic formulas, it came from small daily choices. From waking up and choosing to carry the weight, but not letting it crush him. Today, Romulo doesn't feel hatred. But he doesn't feel longing, either. It's a neutral, almost numb state he's learned to accept. He keeps his distance from his hometown, his mother's family, the memories that still ache. Not out of resentment, but for peace. His search for answers has become quieter now, a search for balance. He finally understands that trauma doesn't define who he is, but it does shape how he grows. And in that realization, he's discovered that maybe true healing isn't about fixing what broke, but learning to walk with it more lightly. Romulo's life didn't turn into a fairy tale, there's no movie perfect ending. But there is something powerful in his journey, the decision to keep going. He doesn't deny the past, but he doesn't drown in it either. He's made resilience his way of being. And even when silence and loneliness come knocking, he greets them differently now. He's learned that, despite the shadows, it's still possible to build light. And in that rebuilding, the greatest victory was learning that being strong isn't about never falling, it's about knowing how to rise, even when no one is watching. And you? What shadows from your past are still walking beside you, unseen? Sometimes, the pain we carry isn't even ours, it's inherited, passed down, like something in the blood. Romulo's story isn't just about suffering. It's about transformation. About a boy who had every reason to fall apart but chose instead to search for meaning in the middle of the chaos. And maybe, you're on that path too, seeking peace, clarity, freedom. The good news? You don't have to be perfect to begin. All it takes is one step, even a small one, toward the light. So reflect, what have you avoided facing because you fear what you might find? So often, the key to healing lies exactly where we don't want to look, in the open wounds, the recurring nightmares, the pain we keep pushing aside. And no, you don't have to walk this path alone. Stories like this are bridges. We see ourselves in the in-betweens, in the silences, in the healing. And realizing that, that's already an act of courage. Maybe the next chapter of your life begins the moment you stop running from the last one. If this story stirred something inside you, even something small, follow that feeling. Save this content, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. We still have so much to uncover, so much to talk about, and so much to heal together. Because sometimes, what feels like the end is really just the beginning of a new way of existing.